Europe thought it had delivered the knockout blow. In Brussels, they called it a historic victory, the largest economic punishment ever imposed on a major power. $245 billion, Russian central bank reserves, oligarch wealth, corporate holdings, frozen, seized, claimed. Politicians smiled for cameras. Officials spoke about justice, deterrence, consequences. For the first time, Europe believed it had found a weapon stronger than tanks, missiles, or armies: money. But what Europe didn't realize was this. The moment they celebrated, the real battle had already begun, because Russia didn't respond with force. They didn't retaliate with energy cutoffs. They didn't escalate militarily. They responded with paper, one legal filing, 847 pages, submitted simultaneously in 14 jurisdictions across 3 continents. And within 72 hours, something extraordinary happened. European legal experts stopped speaking publicly. Government advisors went silent. Behind closed doors, the word being whispered wasn't confidence. It was panic. Because this wasn't a lawsuit. It was a legal ambush, designed not to win quickly, but to make Europe bleed slowly. What Russia uncovered inside European law shocked even Europe's own lawyers. Weaknesses no one wanted to admit existed. Contradictions buried under decades of legal assumptions. And now Europe is discovering a devastating truth. The $245 billion they thought they seized may never be usable. What I'm about to show you is how Russia turned Europe's greatest economic weapon into a liability, why European governments are now quietly discussing settlement, and how this single legal maneuver threatens the future of sanctions as we know them. This is the story of how Europe's biggest financial victory became its most dangerous mistake. To understand why this filing shook Europe so deeply, you first need to understand what Europe actually did, not what politicians claimed, but what happened legally. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Western governments froze roughly $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held abroad. Of that total, $245 billion sat inside European financial institutions, more than anywhere else on Earth. For nearly 2 years, those assets remained frozen but untouched. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit, because under international law, freezing assets is one thing. Seizing them is something entirely different. European lawyers knew this. That's why, despite enormous political pressure, Europe hesitated. They understood the red line. Central bank reserves are not ordinary state property. They are monetary instruments protected by sovereign immunity, one of the oldest principles in international law. But by late 2024, politics overwhelmed caution. Public anger was growing. Ukraine needed money. Leaders wanted to look decisive, so Europe crossed the line. In November, EU officials announced that the frozen Russian reserves would no longer just sit idle. They would be confiscated and transferred into a Ukraine reconstruction fund. Not frozen, not restricted, taken. The legal justification was creative. They claimed the seizure was a form of reparations for Russian aggression, drawing vague parallels to post-World War II precedents. But there was a problem, a massive one. Reparations require one of 3 things: a peace treaty, a binding international court judgment, or voluntary agreement. None of those existed. No treaty, no ruling, no consent. Multiple EU legal advisors warned that this violated international law, sovereign immunity principles, and even the EU's own legal framework. Internal memos explicitly cautioned that confiscation would expose Europe to enormous legal risk. Those warnings were ignored. The announcement went forward. Brussels celebrated. Media applauded. Politicians congratulated one another for their courage. And when Russia's initial response was limited to angry statements and diplomatic protests, Europe relaxed. They thought Russia had no options left. That assumption, that Russia was cornered, was the single biggest miscalculation of the entire conflict. Because Russia had not been improvising. They had been preparing for 2 full years. And the moment Europe crossed from freezing to seizing, Russia's real response began. Russia's response didn't begin with outrage. It began with preparation. For 2 years, while European leaders debated whether seizure was legal, Russia's legal apparatus was quietly assembling what may be the most sophisticated international litigation team ever deployed by a state, not Russian lawyers. That would have been too easy to dismiss. They hired British, French, Swiss, and American legal experts, senior partners from top-tier firms, professors who literally wrote the textbooks on sovereign immunity, former advisors to Western governments themselves. These lawyers weren't asked to defend Russia emotionally or politically. They were asked one question: if Europe crosses the line, how do we break the seizure? Legally. They studied every regulation, every treaty, every precedent Europe relied on, and eventually they found the flaw. Europe's entire seizure mechanism depended on a dangerous legal shortcut. To justify confiscation, EU policymakers quietly reclassified Russian central bank reserves as state property subject to civil enforcement. That move allowed them to argue the assets could be treated like seized corporate holdings or sanctioned private wealth. But under international law, that classification is fatal. Because central bank reserves are not ordinary state assets. They are instruments of monetary policy, and they enjoy absolute sovereign immunity under multiple international conventions, including long-standing UN frameworks and European case law. Europe's own courts had upheld this principle for decades. That's why the assets were frozen for 2 years instead of seized. Europe knew the law, and that's precisely why Russia waited. The moment the seizure occurred, Russia's legal team moved instantly. Within days, a single coordinated filing, 847 pages, was submitted across 14 jurisdictions spanning Europe, North America, and Asia. This wasn't random litigation. Each filing attacked a different pressure point: sovereign immunity violations, illegal reparations claims, contradictions inside EU law, procedural failures, and most devastating of all, Europe's own past legal arguments. Russia wasn't just citing international law, they were citing European law against Europe itself. Case by case, ruling by ruling, they showed that EU courts had repeatedly affirmed that central bank reserves were untouchable, even during sanctions. Europe had now reversed its own legal position. Under international law, that's called estoppel. And courts don't forgive it. This wasn't about winning quickly. This was about turning Europe's legal consistency, one of its greatest strengths, into its greatest vulnerability. And then came the moment that truly shook Brussels. Russia's filings included internal European legal documents, warnings, disagreements, memoranda showing the seizure was political, not legal. The filings never explained how Russia obtained them. They didn't have to. The implication alone was enough. European officials now faced an impossible question. If Russia had access to internal legal deliberations, what else did they know? And that uncertainty was more destabilizing than any ruling could ever be. The brilliance of Russia's strategy wasn't just what they argued, it was where they argued it. They didn't bet everything on a single court. They flooded the system, 14 jurisdictions, 14 legal battlefields, each with different rules, timelines, judges, and standards. International Court of Justice, European Court of Human Rights, Permanent Court of Arbitration, commercial courts in London, Switzerland, Singapore, investment treaty tribunals under multiple bilateral agreements, even US federal courts under foreign sovereign immunity statutes. This created a legal nightmare for Europe, because Russia only needed to win once. Europe had to win everywhere. That asymmetry was devastating. Each case required separate legal teams, separate arguments, separate filings, separate strategies. Legal costs exploded into the hundreds of millions, but cost wasn't the real danger. The real danger was precedent. If even one court ruled that the seizure violated sovereign immunity, Europe's entire position collapsed. Every other court would be forced to reconsider. Every future sanctions regime would be questioned. Within weeks, the cracks began to appear. A Swiss commercial court issued a preliminary injunction freezing European actions related to the seized assets. The money couldn't be used. It couldn't be transferred. It sat in limbo. Then an arbitration panel issued a similar order in a separate proceeding. Then the European Court of Human Rights agreed to hear Russia's claim on an expedited basis, a signal that judges believed the arguments had merit. These weren't final rulings, but they were warnings, signals that Europe's legal confidence was misplaced. Meanwhile, Russia deployed a second, quieter weapon: investment treaty law. Russia had bilateral investment treaties with multiple EU states. These treaties protect foreign investments from expropriation without compensation. Europe argued that central bank reserves weren't investments. Russia responded with Europe's own words. They cited prior EU legal positions where sovereign financial assets had been defined broadly as protected investments. Europe was trapped by its own precedent. Courts don't tolerate legal opportunism. You can't argue one definition when it suits you and the opposite when it doesn't. As legal uncertainty spread, the financial sector reacted, not dramatically, not loudly, but steadily. Sovereign wealth funds reduced exposure to European assets. Central banks diversified reserves. Institutions quietly shifted capital to jurisdictions seen as safer. Bond yields edged higher. The euro weakened. Borrowing costs rose. The European Central Bank faced a dilemma with no good answer: defend the seizure and risk financial instability, or acknowledge legal risk and undermine political authority. They chose silence. And silence in moments like this only accelerates doubt. The seizure that was supposed to demonstrate European power was now doing the opposite. It was exposing fragility. This is where Europe's problem stopped being legal and became systemic. Because once legal uncertainty enters the financial system, it spreads like a slow infection. European insurance companies were among the first to feel it. Political risk insurers suddenly realized something terrifying. If courts ruled the seizure illegal, they could be liable for billions in claims tied to Russian asset confiscation. Premiums spiked overnight. Projects that once looked safe inside Europe were suddenly reclassified as politically exposed. Investments stalled, deals were delayed, capital hesitated. European banks weren't far behind. Institutions that had helped manage, custody, or process Russian reserves faced potential legal exposure. If even one jurisdiction ruled the seizure unlawful, banks could be accused of facilitating illegal expropriation. Legal departments went into overdrive. Clients were advised to reduce exposure. Transactions connected, even indirectly, to the seized assets were flagged or frozen. The complexity multiplied across the system. What began as a targeted sanction was now infecting unrelated financial activity. Then came the political fracture. Eastern European governments, the strongest advocates for seizure, began facing voter backlash. Their economies, closer to Russia and more exposed, were absorbing retaliation faster. Western European states that had warned against confiscation quietly distanced themselves. We raised concerns, officials began saying off the record. This was not unanimous. Unity cracked. Some governments pushed for settlement. Others demanded total resistance. The debate spilled into public view. Russia's strategy was working exactly as intended. Because here was the real genius. Russia was never trying to win quickly. They were trying to make Europe unable to move at all. The seized money couldn't be used. Courts had blocked transfers. Legal risk made distribution impossible. Europe couldn't give it to Ukraine. Russia couldn't retrieve it. The funds sat frozen in legal purgatory. And every day they sat there, Europe paid the price. Legal fees mounted. Markets stayed nervous. Political divisions widened. This wasn't legal warfare aimed at victory. It was attrition. Europe thought asset seizure was a single decisive action. Russia turned it into a long, exhausting legal siege, one that drained money, credibility, and unity with every passing month. And while Europe fought itself, the rest of the world was watching, learning. What terrified European strategists wasn't just the possibility of losing in court, it was the precedent being set in real time. Because this case isn't really about Russia. It's about every country watching from the sidelines. If Europe could seize Russian central bank reserves by political decision, then no reserve held in Europe was truly safe. Not Chinese, not Saudi, not Indian, not Brazilian. Central banks exist for one reason: risk minimization. And political seizure is the ultimate risk. So they reacted the only way rational institutions can: quietly, gradually, systematically. Reserve managers didn't panic sell European assets. That would have been obvious. Instead, they diversified. Small percentage shifts, slow reallocations, moving funds to jurisdictions considered politically neutral or less willing to weaponize finance. Even a 5% shift at the scale of global reserves means hundreds of billions moving away from Europe. Bond markets felt it first. Demand softened. Yields crept upward. Governments found borrowing slightly more expensive. Nothing dramatic, nothing headline-worthy, but persistent. At the same time, something else happened, something Europe never intended. Russia began to look reasonable. In its legal filings, Russia positioned itself not as an aggressor, but as a defender of financial order, not demanding chaos, demanding rules. They weren't arguing politics, they were arguing law. They framed the seizure as dangerous, not just for Russia, but for everyone. And for countries already uneasy about Western financial dominance, the argument resonated. China paid close attention, not publicly, not loudly, but carefully. They studied Russia's filings, the jurisdictional strategy, the use of Europe's own precedents against it. This was a blueprint. If sanctions could be challenged legally, if asset freezes weren't permanent, then the psychological power of Western sanctions was broken. Sanctions work because they feel final. Russia was proving they weren't. Inside Europe, the mood shifted. Legal advisors began telling governments something they didn't want to hear. You may not lose every case, but you don't need to. Because even partial losses would be devastating. A single adverse ruling would force Europe to return funds, or pay damages, or acknowledge legal wrongdoing. Any one of those outcomes would destroy Europe's claim to moral authority. Europe lectures the world about rule of law. What happens if courts rule that Europe violated it? That question now haunts every legal strategy meeting in Brussels, and that's why, quietly, painfully, settlement discussions began. Not officially, not publicly, but in back channels, because the longer this drags on, the worse Europe's position becomes. Russia understands time. They're betting that European political attention spans are shorter than international legal timelines. And history suggests they're right. This is the dilemma Europe now can't escape. If they fight, they risk losing in court and admitting they violated international law. If they settle, they admit the seizure was legally indefensible from the start. There is no clean exit. European officials understand this. That's why the conversation has shifted from winning to damage control. Privately, some are asking an unthinkable question. What if we give most of the money back, not all of it? Enough to neutralize the lawsuits, enough to stop the bleeding. Maybe some funds go to neutral international development agencies. Maybe some are released in stages tied to Russian commitments. Maybe some are returned quietly, without public acknowledgement. Politically, this would be explosive. It would look like surrender. It would validate Russia's strategy. It would expose the seizure as a mistake. But continuing the legal war may be worse. Because if courts rule definitively against Europe, the consequences extend far beyond $245 billion. Europe's entire foreign policy identity is built on one claim, that it represents a rules-based international order. A judgment stating that Europe violated sovereign immunity, ignored its own legal frameworks, and seized assets for political reasons would destroy that narrative. Every future European sanction, every lecture on international law, every criticism of China, Russia, Iran, all of it would be met with the same response. You violated international law yourselves. That reputational damage could last decades. And this is where Russia's strategy becomes truly elegant. They aren't asking courts to side with Russia politically. They're asking courts to side with European legal principles, independent judges, rule of law, sovereign immunity. Europe's greatest strength, its legal systems, has become the weapon used against it. European courts don't take orders from politicians. They follow the law wherever it leads. And Russia is betting that the law leads away from Europe's political decisions. This is legal judo, using your opponent's balance, momentum, and discipline against them. Europe now has to choose: defend political objectives and abandon legal principles, or defend legal principles and undermine political objectives. They cannot do both, and that's the trap Russia built. Patiently, deliberately, and with devastating precision. Here's what makes this moment historically dangerous for Europe. The damage isn't hypothetical anymore. It's already compounding. Sanctions were supposed to be Europe's ultimate non-military weapon, clean, powerful, and final. Freeze the money, and time does the rest. Pressure builds, compliance follows. Russia just shattered that assumption. By turning sanctions into something that can be challenged, delayed, and potentially reversed, Russia has changed the psychology of economic warfare. Sanctions only work if they feel permanent. Once targets believe they can fight back, legally, the fear disappears. And fear is the real enforcement mechanism. Now, every country watching is recalculating. If central bank reserves can be seized today, but legally tied up for years tomorrow, if asset freezes can be contested in court, if political decisions can be undone by judges, then sanctions are no longer a death sentence. They're a legal battle. China understands this immediately. They don't need to copy Russia's strategy yet. They just need to know it exists. They now know how Europe thinks. They know where the legal weaknesses are. They know sanctions aren't absolute. That knowledge alone changes future calculations over Taiwan, trade wars, and financial decoupling. For Europe, the cost is becoming clearer by the month. Capital continues to drift away, not dramatically, but persistently. European financial centers are no longer seen as politically neutral. The euro's ambition as a true global reserve currency takes another quiet hit. Meanwhile, Russia has adapted. They've already written off the money psychologically. They've restructured trade. They've deepened ties outside Europe. They've built workarounds. Time favors them. Because the urgency that drove Europe's decision in 2024 is fading. Public attention moves on. Political priorities change. New crises emerge. But the legal cases don't stop. They grind forward, slowly, relentlessly, draining credibility with every hearing. And here's the final irony. Europe didn't weaken Russia. They weakened the system that made Europe powerful. Trust, predictability, legal consistency. Those are hard to rebuild once damaged. This is no longer just about $245 billion. It's about whether economic sanctions remain a credible tool or whether Russia just exposed them as a bluff backed by paperwork and patience. And that brings us to the final question Europe can't avoid. This is how history will remember this moment. Not as the day Europe punished Russia, but as the moment Europe exposed the limits of its own power. Europe believed financial dominance was permanent, that sanctions were irreversible, that money, once frozen, stayed frozen. Russia proved something far more dangerous. That power built on legal systems can be challenged by those same systems. Europe now faces a choice that has no winning outcome. If they fight until the end and lose even one major case, they admit they violated international law, destroying the moral authority they rely on to sanction others. If they settle quietly, they confirm that the seizure was a mistake and validate Russia's strategy in the eyes of the world. Either way, the message is sent. Sanctions are no longer final. Asset seizures are no longer unquestionable. Western financial dominance is no longer absolute, and the world is already adjusting. Countries are watching. Lawyers are studying the filings. Central banks are rethinking where they park trillions of dollars. Because if Europe can do this to Russia today, someone else could be next tomorrow. Russia understood something Europe forgot. Modern power isn't just about force, it's about patience, about process, about forcing your opponent to destroy their own credibility. One legal move did what tanks and missiles couldn't. It turned Europe's greatest weapon into a liability. And here's the part most people still don't see. This legal war isn't over. The most important rulings haven't come yet. The most dangerous precedents haven't been set yet. And the next move, whether Europe escalates, settles, or fractures, will shape how sanctions work for decades. When the next country challenges Western sanctions, they won't start from scratch. They'll start with Russia's playbook. If you want to understand where global power is actually shifting, not where politicians say it's going, then you need to follow what happens next. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was the opening chapter of a new kind of warfare. And the next case is already being prepared. Hey, I am Yanis, and today I tell you about America and Russia, fight why they fight, and also I tell you about myself,